unfortunately, may be the last BMW M car to have one of these levers in it. It's a sad day. The end is nigh. But let's not be too down in the dumps, because at least they've chosen to put it in something exciting. A short wheelbase M4. Otherwise known as the new M2. I will tell you more about the nose and what lies behind it later, but first, rivals. This car does have some, obviously, the Audi RS3, the Merc A45, but the M2 has always blown them into the weeds for driver engagement. And if this is the last ever purely petrol M car, you'd imagine BMW would have upped the ante somewhat. So have I. Frozen berry, last seen on a bathroom cabinet in the 1970s. Try not to let it distract you from the Cayman GT4 underneath. And yes, you could argue that the GTS 4-litre is a more direct rival, but if we want to investigate just how serious BMW is with the new M2, this will really test its mettle. And yes, it's a manual. The GT4 has been around since 2015, but it's only in the last couple of years that Porsche has capitulated and fitted a PDK. That's dedication to the manual right there. But BMW has also done masses to keep the manual alive. Think back to its most famous Skunk Works project, which took the back axle from an E92 M3 and the engine from a Z4 to create this, the 1M Coupe with a 6-speed manual gearbox. It is the M2's origin story. Is there still a tangible connection? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to drive them until the road runs out. We're going to find some very twisty ones and we're going to count the gear changes. And the one that's made the most wins. Or something like that. We'll keep it real. This is not going to be some fast and furious shift fest. Right, let's start in the M2. Off we go then. 1. 2. I'm not going to carry on doing that actually, I'm going to be counting all the time, not telling you about the car. But now in the UK, this is the only way to get a manual M car, because we do not take the manual M3, the 480 horsepower manual M3 that they do sell in other parts of the world. So this is it, this is your choice. If you want a manual M car still, it's the M2. Do you think I'm being unfair to the M2 comparing it to those rivals? If you do, I think that, like me, you're worried BMW's been missing the mark a bit recently. You look at the XM and to a lesser extent the M4 CSL and just worried that BMW's not quite on its game. But then you look at the M3 Touring and think, well actually, I don't think there is a finer, faster state car out there at the moment. And don't forget, the M2 is a lot of M3 underneath. Oh, this is a great bit of road. Look at these plunges and sweepers. And it's so nice to be guaranteed that you're holding on to the gear you want. I think I need a bit of play with my modes. Let's go for a bit of M2, which I've got set up so it just ramps everything up to maximum. Yeah, it's not a slow car, that's for sure. The 1M will see if it's veered from the path, and the Cayman will see if it's good enough to beat the best. Engine sounds good. Gearbox is good, it's a bit... You can tell it's going to free up a bit more. Whee! Bouncy, bouncy. But it's quick, that shift through there, and it's very precise. Straight 6, rear drive, manual gearbox. What we've got here is an M car that can draw a clear line straight back to the E36 M3. In fact, I think this gear lever literally dates back that far, which means it's now about 30 years old. Why do you need to change it? It's perfect. What this car does do is cover ground really well, really fast. but it feels a big car on the road. It's actually substantially wider than the old M2 because it's based on the 4 Series. It's the same width as an M4. It uses near identical suspension. It's 200mm shorter overall than an M4, and 100mm of that has been taken out of the wheelbase. So it's a substantially changed car. The front end feels stiffer, the back end's a bit softer than an M4. So it's got this really interesting character where the front is really eager and dives into corners, and the back just feels a bit softer, and you can tell it feels a bit more mobile, like it wants to sort of move over and get gone. It's a laugh. On these tight little corners, it is a proper laugh. But nearly everything is third gear. That's all you need. It's got so much torque, you know, 4,000, 5,000. Yeah, it's just got everything you need and more. But it sounds good, and it's not turbo whistle you're getting, it's proper engine noise. So I'm much more impressed with the M2 than I was worried that I might be. It feels a short, broad, not exactly taut, but certainly very dynamically competent and engaging and playful car. The front end just scoots around and the back's just starting to sort of get a bit engaged. It's trying to sort of move around a bit. It's just a more fun way of getting down the road. And in that way, I think it does that better than an M3. Okay, enough gear changes for now. I need to be a brave boy, step outside and show you around the front of this thing. Right, let's have a poke around, which means we've got to come and have a look at the front, doesn't it? Because this is yet another challenging BMW. It just looks a bit clumsy. It's like the front end is made of clay, or that they've left the cover moulds on. It's just a bit weird. And it's the same with the cladding down the sides and round the back. But I want to stop down here and talk about the wheels a bit. We've got 19s on the front and 20s on the back. But it's more the fact that these are 275 width front tyres. That's huge. It's supercar dimensions. Behind them, we've got 380mm brakes. Plenty of stopping power, but we did not need a choice of comfort or sport brakes. BMW, do it once, do it right. You can't have carbon ceramics on this. They will inevitably come with the M2 CS in a couple of years. Right, need to have a quick look inside as well. So, I need to show you what's going on in here, because this would probably be my driving position, but the clutch is very long travel, so in order to get it down comfortably, I need to slide forward, which makes everything feel a bit dominant and makes it slightly awkward to do the gear change here. But the main issue is, do not have these carbon seats in combination with the manual gearbox, because if you do, every time you push the clutch down, the carbon plinth here digs into your leg.
Size does have its obvious benefits. There's now more space in the back and a 390-litre boot out back. But it's hard to get comfy in here. Everything feels very big and close. The steering wheel is huge, the screens dominate. The carbon seats come as part of the M-Race track package, which also brings track tyres and a speed limiter raised to 177 miles an hour. It had to be based on the 4 Series because the 1 Series is now on a front drive mini platform. And that means it's a big car, and a heavy one at over 1,700 kilos.
The last M2 was the most successful M car ever, with over 60,000 sold. However, only 10% of those were manual. That came free, and if you wanted the twin clutch gearbox, that was optional. Now the twin clutch is dead, the automatic is standard, and if you want the manual, it's a £545 option, which admittedly isn't much in the grand scheme of a 65,000 quid car. However, time to drive something that throws the manual in for free. Now, you probably reckon that this is the car I'll be making the most gear changes in because it's naturally aspirated and you're going to need to work with the engine because it hasn't got the torque and all the rest of it. And that is 100% true, but for one thing. Porsche saddled the Cayman GT4 with stupidly long gearing. It's just it's the one thing about this car that sort of undermines its potential for sort of sprinting, if you like, and for just really hitting hard out of corners. Anyway, what I want to do is I'm going to slow right down, okay? No looking down here, right? So, here we go. Off we go through the rev range. Lovely noises coming up. Lots of revs, all the way to 8,000 it's going to go. Look at that. And you can feel that was a bit draggy getting through there, and you're thinking, well, it's third gear, that's fine. But the trouble is, that wasn't third gear, that was second gear. Third gear runs to about 115 miles an hour. It's just the gearing on it is a little bit too long. Well, not a little bit, what am I saying? It's a lot too long. But the car's got enough torque that actually you can just row it along. And oh my God, the rev blipping on it and all that sort of thing. Yeah, I haven't got it turned on at the moment, I'm just doing it myself, but it makes it easy to do it yourself. And that's what you want, isn't it? Hard dampers at the moment, nothing wrong with that. It's immaculate. That whole precision of this car. It's not the BMW, the new M2, certainly, it's trying to ape the feel of the old M2 while it's still using 4 Series underpinnings, which is a little bit of a challenge for it. And also, in order to do that, it means that it's sort of over-brightened and over-sharpened in some ways. It comes across as like a bit of a caricature somehow. Whereas this isn't trying to be anything it's not. It's just a wonderful sports car doing wonderful things on a wonderful road. Oh, it's just so enjoyable to drive. You're locked in, the seats are fantastic, the driving position's wonderful. It's an easy car to get on with because of the controls and switch gear are understandable. Ah, proper bit of kit. And yeah, the engine is amazing when you get right up it. You don't need to be up it all the time because actually through that mid-range it's the crispness of it, the response to your foot, that actually is what gives you the satisfaction from it. Oh, it's such a short, flicky shift as well. What am I saying? I think this probably will do. I think this probably will do the most shifts. Just going to be rowing it around for the sake of it because it's so good. Right, autoblip, is it any better? Yeah, high revs are pretty good, isn't it? Just be so quick with it. Turn it off again. I actually prefer doing it myself. Oh, it's such a richly rewarding car. There's just so much tactility to it. Love the sort of Alcantara steering wheel here as well. And the positioning of everything, just where you're rowing the gear lever around in relation to where you sit and how close it is to the steering wheel. But of course, this is a much more expensive thing than the M2. The M2 starts at 65 grand, this starts at 82. So the argument is, would a GTS 4 litre, which is about 75 grand, still have done the job that this does? And I think the answer is yes, it would actually. So the BMW feels a burlier, bit more bombastic and a little bit more artificial to drive than this does. And that doesn't surprise me in the least. That's about where I thought it would be. And I could see why the M2 might be a car for you over this, because let's face it, it's got 4 seats and a big boot. You could use it as your daily and it would be very comfortable and capable. Right, let's go and have a go in a 1M. Off we go in the 1M then, and I'll let you in on a little secret. This is one of my all-time favourite cars. I just loved how sort of boisterous and bombastic it was, even with only 330 horsepower. Well, so how's it stood up to 12 years of aging? Pretty well, I have to say. Really, really well. It's just so exciting around corners because it's not particularly locked down. It feels quite flighty and edgy, and the steering is very sharp. The way you sit in the car feels very different. These seats, for starters, have nothing like the lateral support and grip of the other two cars. You also sit higher, you feel a bit more on top of the car. You've got to reach down further to do the gear change. But I hope in time, I hope the M2's gear change frees up as much as this one has, because this is just so fast and fluid. You can be so quick with it. 335 horsepower. I know it's now 120 horsepower behind an M2, but this is a smaller, lighter, more fidgety car. It simply doesn't feel like it has the suspension technology that would cope with 450 horsepower in the same way that the M2 does. But I know people have turned the wick up on these to huge levels and report there is still an absolute barrel of laughs, and I can imagine that. But it's fun enough with only this much. Compiling through Wales in beautiful weather on lovely roads in a manual 1M. This is great. Lots of gear changes. Because in this, you throw them in for the sake of it. Because it doesn't really matter, because you've got all the torque from the engine, it doesn't really matter what gear you're in. So this takes you back to where the M2 story started. This is when it was just more of a skunk works project where you stick the Z4 engine in from the Z4 and you fiddle about with some M suspension and all the rest of it, and you end up with something strangely bespoke and unusual. So the M2 then feels like it's taken this formula and modernized it, but in so doing it's lost some of the character of the original. It's just so proficient around corners that now, rather than sort of fundamentally deciding how this car should look and act and feel, they're looking backwards to the M2 to go, how can we recapture that with 4 Series underpinnings? And as a result, they end up with a car that's very good. I still think it's a terrific car, but it doesn't have that character and charisma that this has by being more flawed. So I was expecting the engine to be rowdier and more present in this, but actually it's not. It's quite distant and in the background. You're not really aware of it. It's just there. I mean, it provides a plentiful thump of torque and power, redlined up at 7,000. But the gearbox just gives you brilliant access to that. But the engine itself isn't actually that exciting, so it relies on the chassis to really shine. And in this, it does. It's a tenacious little thing. It just wants to dive, it feels alert, and this is why it's just terrific. It's got so much, you can't just steer it in one movement like you do the other two where they feel locked onto line. This thing moves around a bit more, it gets more, you're engaging with it because it forces you to. And I tell you what, it's refreshing to drive a car that's not trying to distract you with loads of screens and modes and everything, because you haven't got any of that in here. You've got some buttons, that's all it is, and a rotary controller down here for the old iDrive, and that's your lot. Off you go, crack on, have fun. But this car was a whisker under 40 grand when it was first launched, and you still will not find one for under 40 grand. Most of them are around 60, 65. And driving it again, you can sort of see why. It's just an addictive little thing to drive.
Wales is a great country for driving and exploring. The further we drove, the smaller and narrower the roads became, sweeping A roads leading into sinuous B roads until the road markings gave out completely and we were weaving our way around hills, reservoirs and giant potholes, a sure sign of a dead end ahead.
Here we are then, quite literally the end of the road, and the 1M, that remains a proper feisty little tough nut. The Cayman, that's a masterpiece, just one that needs a shorter final drive, and the M2 does a commendable job of keeping the flame alive. But the best sports car here is the Cayman. And yes, before you say anything, I think we'd be saying the same thing if we had a GTS up here rather than a GT4. Gear changes then. Well, that went to... the Porsche had the most gear changes, not because they were necessary, but because it was fun changing gear in it. So what conclusions can we draw on the M2? Well, firstly, that BMW has done a commendable job in making an M3 feel and act like an M2, but an M2 with a bit of middle age spread. It's more capable than before, but not as tenacious. However, if you want a manual M car, it's now this or nothing. Just don't have it with those seats.